Thank you for joining us. We are recording this event, as you just heard. So my name is Adriana Espinosa. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Equity and Justice at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm really happy to be here and facilitating this important, really critical discussion today. As I mentioned, I'm Deputy Commissioner for Equity and Justice. It's a relatively new role at DEC, and my role includes overseeing DEC's Office of Environmental Justice, and by extension, the climate justice work that we oversee at DEC, the Office of Indian Nation Affairs, and the internal diversity, equity, inclusion, and civil rights work for the agency. My team at the Office of Environmental Justice will be advising the rulemaking team as needed on the equity and disadvantaged community considerations under the New York Cap and Invest program. So I wanted to start off with just giving you all a sense of the why we're all here today. So New York State is still pre-proposal on this program for Cap and Invest. And during the initial drafting phase, we solicited input from a broad range of stakeholders via public comments. We held a series of roundtables on different sectors of the program over the last several months, and we have had some meetings with stakeholders. And the purpose we're here today is to create an open and public forum with climate justice and environmental justice leaders to discuss Cap and Invest, hear their thoughts, concerns, and recommendations that they want New York State to consider to ensure that benefits and emissions reductions in disadvantaged communities through New York's Cap and Invest program. So it's a little bit different from the previous roundtables. If you were part of joined in for those previously, and we're flipping the script a little bit. The audience for this event, in addition to the public, is the rulemaking team across DEC and across NYSERDA. We will use the input that we gather here to inform both the rule development and the metrics and analyses that the state will use to assess impacts to disadvantaged communities. So I hope that this is a first of many conversations. I would love to reconvene again once program leanings and additional pre-proposal materials are released for the leaders joining us today to be able to provide additional comments and feedback on those materials after we release them. So a quick run through of what to expect from today's event. We wanted to start by level setting a bit on Cap and Invest with a presentation by John Binder. He is the Deputy Commissioner for Climate, Air, and Energy at DEC. And briefly, he's going to cover, what is Cap and Invest and the Climate Act, some guiding principles from the Climate Act scoping plan and principles from Governor Kathy Hochul. We're going to cover what we're hearing from EJ stakeholders so far, what we have learned from other jurisdictions. The presentation will also cover items under consideration in the rulemaking process, and then we'll give you a sense of where we are in that process and the next steps. So we're going to try to keep that presentation brief so that we can get to our panel. After the discussion, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we'll dive into a discussion on the Cap and Invest program. After that, we are going to do a Q&A. Folks in the audience are welcome to submit questions at any point in the process. And our team is on and they're following along, and they're going to help organize the questions for me to facilitate after the panel. You may ask questions to the panelists, and we also have representatives from the state team who can answer questions about the rulemaking process for the Cap and Invest program. John Binder is from DEC, and Vlad Gutman from NYSERDA are on the line to respond to questions from the regulatory team. But we've got a deep bench here today. We're joined by Alana Cadell-Tuckey, Chris Lalone, Michael Sheehan, and Ona Papagiorgio from DEC, and Samir Ranade, James Wilcox, and Michael DeRamio from NYSERDA online as well. And we can call on them as needed during the Q&A portion of the event. And we will try to save as much time as possible so that we can have a robust Q&A after the panel wraps up. So with that, let's get started. I'm happy now to turn it over to my colleague, John Binder, to run through our presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Adriana. Thank you all for being here today, to the panelists and for those watching as well. As Adriana said, I'm John Binder. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Climate, Air, and Energy here at DEC. We really do appreciate your time as we work to design this program. We want to make sure that we ultimately design and implement an effective and equitable cap and invest program. So while all stakeholder input is important, we think today's session is particularly critical given the importance of really keeping equity and climate justice at the center of this program. So as Adriana said, our goal for today is really to make sure that we're having an open forum and an open dialogue with climate and environmental justice leaders to discuss this program and concerns and recommendations. Of course, the goal here is not just to be asking you questions like we did in our June series of webinars. So I am going to try to keep this brief. I want to give, as Adriana mentioned, a brief level-setting presentation to help inform the discussion that Adriana, the panelists, and all of you are about to have. So I'm going to start with just a very quick overview and refresher of the Climate Act and the Cap and Invest program. We all call that NYSERDA for New York Cap and Invest. We'll provide a quick sense and a quick reminder of where we are in this regulatory development process and the process of developing this program. I'm going to outline some of the key considerations that we are evaluating with respect to disadvantaged communities. I'll summarize quickly some of the highlights of the feedback that we've heard so far, particularly from the perspective of equity and from the perspective of concerns with respect to disadvantaged communities. We'll briefly note some of the items that we've learned from observing other similar programs in other states, such as Washington and California, and then I'll wrap it up with some of the next steps in our process and how we hope to continue these discussions. So moving on to the next slide. I know that many of our panelists and those in the audience, or probably all of the panelists and those in the audience, are very familiar with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act, and its requirements, but it is important to start there since that's part of why we're all here. So the Climate Act does set the state on a path towards a carbon neutral economy, and it requires at least an 85% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels by 2050, with a near-term requirement of 40% by 2030. So there's also additional requirements in the Climate Act to help achieve those directives, and that includes the mandate for 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040 and other clean energy commitments. Of course, as we all know, the Climate Act also contains important provisions reflecting critical commitments to equity and climate justice. So really, this is part of why we're here today and why this particular conversation is so important, and hearing from you all on the panel and in the audience is so important. So we want to hear from you all on how to design and implement this program in a way that meets these important commitments. So moving on to the next slide, what are these commitments that I'm referring to? So the law of the Climate Act, it really does have unique and important provisions that help to frame some of the key equity considerations, not just for this NYSERDA program, but really for everything that we are doing to implement the Climate Act. First, the law requires that at least 35%, with a goal of 40% or more, of all the investments that come in from this program the revenue that comes in has to be invested for the benefit of disadvantaged communities. And we do expect that to equate to significant financial resources, much needed financial resources. We know that there's an ongoing and parallel statewide community air monitoring initiative under the Climate Act, and some of the initiatives and programs that are identified as part of that effort are examples of some of the things we hope to be funded through investments from this program in the future. But really, in addition to the important investments that will come out of revenue from this program, we do want to focus today on regulatory mechanisms. We want to hear about any additional regulatory mechanisms that we should consider on the cap side of the program, really so that we can help ensure that this program results in emission reductions in disadvantaged communities. And I want to highlight two specific requirements that are written directly into the Climate Act, since those are so key to how we consider all of these equity and disadvantaged community related issues. Again, not just under this program, but under all Climate Act programs. The first is that the law requires that DEC's NYSERDA regulation not result in net increases in coal pollutant emissions and not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And the second is that the law also requires us, and really all agencies, not just DEC, to prioritize reductions of both greenhouse gas emissions and coal pollutants in disadvantaged communities. So Moving on to the next slide, really, with that background in mind, I do want to just remind everybody where we are in the process, because those two key requirements are really, again, what we want to hear most about today. How do we make sure that we meet those two requirements as we design this NICI program? So as Adriana mentioned in the beginning, we are still relatively in the early stages of designing the details of this program. And throughout this process, we want to make sure we're continuing significant stakeholder engagement. We have not made any final decisions at this point in the program. That's, again, by design. We want to hear from climate justice and environmental justice advocates, but really all types of stakeholders before we finalize any of these program elements. So as many of you will recall, back in June, we held an initial stage of pre-proposal webinars. That included 7 sessions, and we recognized that we provided a lot of information and asked a lot of questions of you and other stakeholders. We did receive a lot of excellent input on these issues. And in fact, all of the comments are now posted on our website, capitinvest.ny.gov, so you can review anything that was submitted to us. So we're now in that second stage here, where we are assessing this input that we've received so far as we further refine the details of our program. So we're holding this session today focused on equity and climate justice. We have another labor-focused roundtable that's scheduled for next month, September 15th. And then after that, later this year, we will move on to our second phase of pre-proposal outreach, where, again, rather than asking a series of questions of all of you, we want to provide our initial program leanings, really an indication of where we're headed. Still not final decisions at that stage, but we want to be able to get some input on what the shape of the program is looking like at that stage. After that, we would issue a formal regulatory proposal, and that would include the normal regulatory process with public notice and comment, hearings, and so forth. After that, we would have the programs begin for compliance and our revenue start coming in 2025. That's our goal at this point. So moving on to the next slide, I want to provide a quick summary of how the program is intended to work. So first, the cap part of Cap and Invest is that we're going to set a legally enforceable limit. That's the cap, the emissions cap, on the annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in the state. Each year, that cap is going to decline, so that overall greenhouse gas emissions will reduce and will continue to go down. And a second key feature of the program is going to be a legal requirement that large sources of greenhouse gas emissions purchase or obtain emission allowances for each ton of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with their activities. So that means that to comply with the program, obligated sources will have to provide these emission allowances to DEC to cover their emissions. And once that happens, once they're provided to us for compliance, allowances are permanently retired. They can never be utilized again. And because that amount goes down each year, that's the cap part of the program. That's how we have the legal certainty that greenhouse gas emissions will in fact decrease and help us to achieve our statewide requirements. The third key part of this program and how it's going to work is that these emission allowances will be sold primarily through auctions by the state. So that will result in proceeds that will be utilized for multiple purposes under the Climate Action Fund, which is set forth basically about a third of those funds will be provided directly back to New Yorkers to help address energy affordability, and roughly 2/3 will be available for other types of investments to further reduce emissions. But for today's panel, we're focused mostly on the fourth point, the last but not least point, which is, making sure that this program is prioritizing disadvantaged communities. Because as we've said, really in all of the webinars that we've held, we know that these communities have long suffered as a result of environmental injustice. And so we want to make sure we design the program to ensure that emission reductions occur in those communities, both through targeted investments, but as well as through regulatory mechanisms. So again, that's what we want to talk about today. And that's what we want to hear about from all of you. In addition to the commitment with respect to investments that this program generates, how do we design the program in a manner to make sure that those two key commitments occur? So on to the next slide. Just a quick refresher of kind of how we got to this point. So as I think most folks are aware, the Climate Action Council recommended an economy-wide Cap and Invest program at the end of 2022 when the final scoping plan was released. that recommended that scoping plan concluded that a cap and invest program would be the most cost-effective means of achieving the emission limits. So essentially, the recommendation is that we want to get to the 40% by 2030 and the 85% by 2050 emission reduction requirements. And we think cap and invest is the most affordable way overall for us to get to those requirements. There is some additional detail provided in the scoping plan that is worth looking at, which is chapter 17 of the final scoping plan, and it's available on climate.ny.gov. One of the key things for purposes of this conversation are some specific recommendations that we're considering, and I'll get to that in a minute, about specific design elements for how to address disadvantaged communities. So we're following those recommendations as well as principles that the governor has outlined for us, including in her State of the State this year, directing us to establish this program in line with the scoping plan recommendations and principles that the governor, again, has outlined for us, so that we get to the point of we have a program that meets those requirements, 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050, and also helps to address equity through both investments and regulatory mechanisms. So moving on to the principles in the next slide, just a reminder of the principles that Governor Hochul laid out for us back in January. The first principle is one of affordability. So we want to make sure that we design this program in a manner that does not increase energy burden on low and moderate income households in particular. So this is an important principle for us and also is related to disadvantaged communities. And that's, again, why a portion of the allowance proceeds will go directly back to New Yorkers. There's also, of course, the disadvantaged community commitment that I mentioned, the 35% minimum floor of investments that have to benefit disadvantaged communities. And then other key principles with respect to climate leadership, which is really about working with our other state partners, making sure that we're creating jobs and preserving economic competitiveness, and helping to fund a sustainable future through these clean energy investments. So as we're working to design this program, we're trying to balance all of these principles. And we do have ongoing modeling and analytical work that is being undertaken in parallel that's going to help us evaluate and inform some of these choices. I'll mention that briefly in a minute as well. So now moving on to the next slide, I want to talk just for a few minutes about some of the highlights that we've been hearing from all of you, from the stakeholders in the initial round of pre-proposal outreach. So this, of course, is not intended to be an exhaustive list. I know that many folks on the panel today will be able to emphasize and highlight points from their perspectives during the course of today's discussion. But these are some of the key themes that we've been hearing from environmental justice, climate justice, and equity-related stakeholders. So first, the one key recommendation that we have heard is that we should be prohibiting or limiting emission allowance trading. We've also been hearing that we should be setting caps on specific timetables, making sure that we're minimizing costs and emissions and other impacts located within disadvantaged communities. We want to make sure that we've been hearing that we should be ensuring adequate investments from the program and also ensuring that emission reductions are verifiable and enforceable. So moving on to the next slide, some additional things that we're hearing. And again, I don't pretend that I can do justice to the comments from the perspective of how many of you would present them, but I just wanted to quickly highlight some of the things, the themes that are emerging from the comments, because we are hearing them and we are listening to them and considering them as we move on to the next phase of the program. So continuing on, we are hearing that it's very important to track greenhouse gas and co-pollutant emissions from all sources. How important the process is to make sure that we're being transparent and demonstrating both emission reductions and how those investments are spent. Again, procedurally, we want to make sure that we are ensuring disadvantaged community representation in both oversight and program review. That's one of the key themes that we've heard. And also that we should consider burdens and job impacts on businesses located in disadvantaged communities. Moving on to the next slide. This is a little bit about the steps, the recommended steps. So, some of the recommendations that we're hearing are really specific about what we should be implementing substantively within the program, and some are about the process that we should take as we design the program. And both of these sets of recommendations are really important for us, and we're considering all of them. I outlined the process that we're intending to follow at the beginning. I think it shares a lot of the features with the recommended steps here. So at this point, I would say that we are in the midst of step 2 in this recommended process. So we're working to establish robust communication with disadvantaged community and other stakeholders. This panel is one example of that. As Adriana said, hopefully not the end of that conversation. And based on this input, we're working towards step 3 in this outline here, where we would include specific program elements to target these concerns based on feedback that we're hearing. So just to give you a sense of what we're hearing as a recommended process and how that aligns with the process that we have been following and intend to continue to follow. I think recommended steps 4 and 5 here, which have to do with tracking and measuring progress and conducting regular reviews, are things that are really critical and that we would do once we have the program in place. Now I want to turn briefly on the next slide to what we're learning from other states. As we've talked about in some of our earlier June webinars, we do know that other jurisdictions, especially Washington and California, but others as well, have similar programs in place, and we want to make sure we learn from them, both what's been done right, lessons learned, opportunities to improve, making sure that we're learning from their experiences. Now, that's really for the program as a whole, as well as with respect to disadvantaged communities and equity. So, I just want to emphasize that what we have here are just a few of our own initial takeaways from those states. We understand that environmental justice and climate justice stakeholders may have their own takeaway lessons from these jurisdictions. And I hope and expect that we will hear more about that during the panel discussion later. So, but I think some of the themes that come through from both states are the importance of implementing complementary programs alongside of a cap and invest program, the importance of clear communications and expectation setting with all stakeholders. So now, moving on to the next slide, we're here because we want to make sure we are prioritizing disadvantaged communities. So one of our objectives, again, laid out right in the law, and also important for us, is making sure that we're prioritizing emission reductions within disadvantaged communities. But at the same time, we also want to make sure we're prioritizing other objectives with respect to disadvantaged communities. So that includes making sure we're raising revenue that can adequately fund investments in disadvantaged communities, making sure that we're keeping high quality jobs available and businesses available within those communities, and ensuring that we're decreasing energy burden and maintaining energy reliability. So these are all things, when we're talking about prioritizing disadvantaged communities, I think first and foremost, we're talking about emissions, but we're also talking about these other priorities as well. So on to the next slide. I want to summarize a few of the specific regulatory provisions and options that we're considering as part of the NICI program. So I mentioned how we have heard from advocates that there is a recommendation on either totally prohibiting or severely limiting allowance trading under this program. I do want to be clear with everybody that we do expect there to be at least some allowance trading as part of this program. We do see this as a key way of ensuring the overall affordability and cost effectiveness of the program, really, and that was, I think, recognized by the Climate Action Council in the scoping plan. So within that context, the scoping plan outlined at least 3 options for DEC and NYSERDA to consider with respect to trading in disadvantaged communities. And a lot of these are intended to protect against the possibility of the creation of emission hotspots, which we know is one of the key concerns of these communities. So just to quickly summarize these 3 options, and again, I hope we're going to hear some good discussion and input about all of these throughout the course of today's panel. But the first option is prohibiting disadvantaged communities from purchasing allowances from outside of those communities. So sources that are located within disadvantaged communities would have limits or prohibitions on how much allowance trading they can do. The second would be setting a source-specific cap on emissions for sources that are located within disadvantaged communities. And those caps would decline over time. And then third, we also are considering requiring disadvantaged community sources located within or near those communities, to surrender allowances at some multiple. So in other words, instead of what would typically be required of a source, where they have to provide 1 allowance to cover 1 ton of emissions, certain sources might have to provide 1.5 or 2 to 1 or some other ratio to address these concerns. This might not be the only list of options though, so I do hope we'll hear about other ideas as well. during today's conversation. So moving on quickly to complementary programs on the next slide. We know that the Cap and Invest program does not operate in a vacuum. We think one of the benefits of this type of program, the Cap and Invest program, is that it automatically accounts for and works in tandem with these types of programs. And we did hear a lot from stakeholders about how we should be considering other types of programs, whether that's setting emissions caps on specific sources or specific sectors, developing other types of standards, whether it's clean fuel standards, building standards, transportation-related standards. These are things that we have been hearing and that we are considering in line with the in parallel with the Cap and Invest program. So just on the next slide now, some additional thoughts that we have heard with respect to participation and communication. We know that this kind of ongoing collaboration and dialogue is critical. We want to make sure that groups such as the Climate Justice Working Group, which of course is also created and has a critical role under the Climate Act, and other types of community advisory boards are having a role in consultation and design of the program. We also know the format of these types of meetings is important. We're having a virtual meeting today, but maybe sometimes we want to have in-person meetings or make sure that we do have recorded meetings available. We do, by the way, have this meeting getting recorded, and other meetings are always posted on capandinvest.ny.gov. So, and then I'd want to spend the last minute here before we turn it back to Adriana and the panel, talking about the modeling and some next steps here. So on the next slide. So one of the 7 webinars that we held in June was focused on modeling and analysis, excuse me. That was back on June 20th. So draw folks' attention to that particular webinar. But really, as mentioned earlier, this work, the modeling work is ongoing, and it's going to help us evaluate the costs and the impacts of our various program design and policy choices. There will be additional information and sets of inputs regarding cost assumptions that are used in the modeling that will be shared in the future. And NYSERDA and DEC are working to develop complementary analyses on air quality and health impacts and workforce implications. So we are interested in feedback and comment on this component as well, on analytical methods, modeling framework and coverage, because again, this is going to be an important part of our program design process as well. Ultimately, this analysis will accompany the proposed rule when it is published for public comment, because it's part of our SAPA, State Administrative Procedure Act requirements with respect to evaluating the impacts of regulations. And then just to wrap it up quickly here, on the next slide. So just, what's coming next? We are, as a reminder, we're planning 2 rounds of pre-proposal outreach. Right now, we're sort of in maybe what we would call phase 1B, as we have these types of stakeholder roundtables and dialogue. Later on this year, we are going to be coming out with a 2nd round of feedback prior to formally issuing the draft regulatory proposal for public comment. So, all that to say, this program is still under development. We have not made any decisions, but we want to make sure we are continuing to recognize the things that we've learned from the stakeholder comments, other state experiences, and the key considerations with respect to disadvantaged communities. And that really is not just the investment piece, but also ensuring no disproportionate burden in disadvantaged communities and prioritizing emission reductions in disadvantaged communities. So with that, we look forward to this continued conversation and really to today's conversation in particular. But again, nothing is written in stone yet, and that's why we're having these and other ongoing stakeholder conversations. So the last slide just kind of has some of the links where you can see, again, all the meetings are posted. You can still provide input and comments through that platform, and you can sign up to make sure that you receive notice of meetings like these going forward. So with that, I will turn it back to Adriana and the panel. Thanks very much. Look forward to the questions.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you going through that presentation with us. So let's get into it now. I want to switch over into the panel. I'm going to introduce our panelists and provide them a few minutes to make a statement that so that they can frame their contributions on the panel, key things on their mind or questions. If they have questions for the state team, we can tee up. You can let us know your questions and we'll tee those up during the Q&A. So let's get to it. it, I want to start by introducing Raya Salter, ladies first. So Raya is Executive Director and founder of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center, and she is also a member of the Climate Action Council. Raya, over to you.
Can folks hear me?
We can.
All right, so I want to thank everyone. Thank you, DEC, for this opportunity. Yes, I'm Raya Salter, member of the State Climate Action Council and the Gas Transition Subgroup, the Executive Director of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. We're a national think tank, and we also convene the Energy Justice Alliance, a Black-led BIPOC coalition advocating for a just transition with the focus on racial and economic justice. So one thing I want to say that myself and others, prominently the Climate Justice Working Group, stated throughout the Climate Action Council process that we are very concerned about market-based cap and trade programs. Why? They've been shown to be ineffective and inequitably burden frontline communities. These schemes allow polluting facilities, which are more likely to be located in frontline communities, to purchase allowances, sometimes offsets, and engage in trading that can allow them to evade caps and essentially pay to pollute. So as has been stated in the slides before, and said in the scoping plan in the law, these factors must not be allowed to burden disadvantaged communities. And the law, in fact, requires the opposite, that emissions and co-pollutant reductions are prioritized in frontline communities. And that's the first point that I'm just overarching point that I want to make. No program should go forward unless it achieves that. So how do we get there? I want to continue with another pretty simple truth. Cap and invest market schemes sound complicated, and they are, but the state law already requires that we reach 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040 and net zero by 2050. The law requires the DEC to put rules in place to do that this year. The law says they must be legally enforceable. So point one, the DEC must use its existing authority to do just that. Second, the rules must in substantial part reflect the findings of the scoping plan. So what did the scoping plan say? The state can't meet its GHG limits without an integrated plan to retire fossil fuel plants and downsize the fossil gas system, period. The state did an integration analysis to map the state's pathway to those limits, and it's going to require that we stop using so much gas and downsize the system. We got to shut down the peakers and retire fossil gas generators. The plants that should be prioritized for shutdown are the peakers and those identified by the Just Transition Working Group in the CAC process. And the scoping plan provides comprehensive plans for a just transition with committed funds to make sure communities aren't left behind. And it's important, I want to say again, the scoping plan says that the gas system doesn't have a long history of analysis and policy development on emissions reductions. So an orderly transition will require coordination across multiple sectors, including integrated planning with the decarbonization, not all solutions of the power generation sector. So the plan developed a framework through which agencies can develop this plan. It was called the Gas Transition Framework. That the scoping plan says the DEC and the PSC should lead that process. And that's something that needs to happen because a market-based mechanism on its own cannot reach the CLCPA's just transition goals. The scoping plan is clear. Cap and invest won't equitably reduce emissions until we can see the simultaneous closing of polluting fossil fuel facilities. So that's a design element. The state needs to use its authority to make sure that the cap and invest program reflects that retirement result. And as a planning priority, in order to do that, the DEC needs to get with that gas transition framework with the PSC to make that happen. And period, if it places a disproportionate burden on disadvantaged communities, it won't be compliant with the act. It should not go forward at all. And the state is required to do an analysis that will show that simple truth before it can move forward. So thank you again so much for this opportunity to discuss this. I will turn it back to our Deputy Commissioner.
Thank you, Raya. Heard that. I appreciate that. I want to turn it over now to Eddie Bautista, who is the Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance and a member of the state's Climate Justice Working Group. Eddie, thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thanks, Adriana, and thanks as always to Raya, who highlighted so many important issues and concerns that we are grappling with here in New York. Just a couple of opening comments and a couple of other just observations before we go back to the rest of the group. You know, I'm I'm a long time fan of calling things as they are, and whenever I see something that is not being explicit in its definition, it raises antenna, and that's been my feeling about this program since it's been announced. Even though, as we've heard repeatedly, trading will be seen as a component, significant component probably of this program, the state keeps calling it a cap and invest program. Call it what it is, folks. It's a cap, trade, and invest. There's a reason some of us suspect you guys have not been calling it cap and trade, partly because of the some of the failures and some of the issues that we've seen from existing cap and trade programs in other parts of the country. Just a couple of other items, as Raya touched on, cap, trade, and invest systems do not guarantee emission reduction targets. This has been observed regardless of the state, and it's been exacerbated in these other states by offset programs. In California, the Legislative Analyst's Office found that their cap trade program is not currently positioned to ensure the state meets its statutory 2030 goal, much less the California Air Resources Board's more ambitious target. One of the things that we've also, as Raya mentioned, we've looked at and noticed how the cap and trade system has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. The California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and the University of Southern California's Equity Center both have documented that facilities in California in at least some problematic source categories, such as refineries, have essentially been left uncontrolled under the cap and trade program. As a result, EJ communities across the state, and especially in the San Joaquin Valley, have been overburdened with localized pollution created through the program. One of the other components that we've been seeing, in addition, is to the degree that there have been emissions reductions in California, we've seen, for example, in the first few years of cap and trade, from 2013 to 2015, that pollution increased in areas with a higher share of people of color or a higher score on their CalEnviro-Screen analyses. One of the other things that we have also been wondering is, how is the state modeling its cap and trade? What is the modeling that the state is using in terms of what the scope of the modeling for the cap and trade the state is looking at? What are the program design features that you are most interested in modeling? I, for one, would like to know, are you going to be modeling a no trading scenario? I'll be honest, our sense, based on talking to our allies and our own independent analyses, it's been the combination of trading, unlimited banking, and offsets that have led to cap and trade, not only in some cases increasing emissions, and other cases at a much less equitable rate with non-disadvantaged communities. We've seen that it's the interplay of those three program scenarios that lead to that disproportionate outcomes. I'll stop there, but I think that there's, for one, we'd like to know more about what exactly is the scope that the state's looking at in its modeling. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. And we're going to tee up those questions for the Q&A portion. But I think, to your point earlier, we want to define these terms together, and maybe we can use some time during the panel to dig more into those metrics and definitions. I want to turn now to Aaron Mayer, who is a longtime environmental justice leader and forever Adirondacks director at the Adirondack Council. Aaron?
Thank you. I'm sitting here with my brother Eddie, but I think I'm one of the older OGs here, Sister Raya. This has been, as I say, a long time fight. So excellent points, excellent starting points that Sister Raya laid out with regards to key principles, Eddie with regards to current burdens with regards to the structure. But also, I came to the Adirondack Council from New York State Health Department. So I'm a retired epidemiological spatial analyst. I've just made deep disease map that in Bureau of Chronic Disease Evaluation and Research. And we talk about frontline burdens and risk. Again, these plants, these facilities are concentrated in what we call EJ communities. And you can look at, I think there's now a climate economic justice screening tool that all of us in some way or another have collaborated in and helped set up our work over the past 2 decades have resulted in these EJ maps that they can look at the communities. One of the problems with the current set of maps is that they don't control for race. So that's one of the issues. So you don't even get to deal with the minority health disparities that are coming out of these climate impacts. And the critical point as we talk about cap and trade and cap and invest, again, Eddie hit the nail right on the head. He called it what it is. We're creating markets in a place and space where the real burden is a public health burden as well as a financial burden on frontline communities. So the question at the end of the day is that there's going to be blocks and pots of money. And what I care about right now, relative as we move toward 2030, is how that is invested in frontline communities, not only from a point of remediation and relief. So if we are having these peaker plants, or some peaker plants are not being phased out in an efficient manner, what are the investments from a public health side, in these places and spaces that are going to be protective of human health and the environment? And it's not so much, the investment of just having people adapt to and live with a chronic exposure. But, the other issue is that what are the other benefits that are going to accrue to them, given that they are being armed, that can help remediate in a very significant and tangible way? Do we have an interagency task force, not just with DEC and NYSERDA, but where's DHCR? Where is DOL? Where is DOH? We need a holistic approach by government. We can't not segment this off and piecemeal this off. The climate crisis is 360 and all-encompassing. We just cannot say that this particular program is going to solve a problem by putting out a few dollars. We need to know about real tangible investments in these frontline communities. The other piece is that this is going to be a market transformer. We already see with the IRA is transforming the national and global markets with its signaling, its trillions of dollars of investment, the largest investment in our nation's history. And pardon me, I set a timer, and Brother Eddie knows I get on my soapbox. But the critical thing I'm looking at here is the economic side, the workforce development side. I know you're going to have a panel on that later, but this is where the Department of Labor, CUNY and SUNY comes in. And we don't want just those institutions to soak up the funds, but actually be the points that help communities develop as I say, the business and MWB infrastructure that can take part of this economic transforming opportunity. We're talking about, I work with the Mohawk Nation and Champlain Hudson Power Express with Hydro-Quebec. They're going to be already pulling that cable down, but they're also fusing a collaboration whereby the tribe is actually a business partner. So they will be at the front end and benefiting directly. We also need to look at, as that cable is coming along, making sure the communities, it's not just communities getting the energy, but the jobs. Where's the workforce development? Now we're shutting down prisons in the Adirondacks. We have an opportunity through State Department of Labor, which runs the Job Corps programs, to actually convert these to job training centers, workforce development centers. We should be on this ASAP. We should not be waiting on this after the fact. As we are talking about what to invest in with this Cap and Invest, is having the frontline opportunities for the communities. We created something called the Timbuktu Summer Science Career Institute, merging with SUNY and CUNY. And this is getting high school kids, college prep, already in the green job and green economy space, but also on the 30 by 30 side, which is the wilderness protection side. So it's not only just are we looking at, the shutting down and, as I say, and providing green jobs there, but the whole portfolio and range of jobs, because again, some upstate SUNY schools are better positioned at certain job training than downstate schools. So we got to bridge that gap. So when we talk about the investment, we want to talk about investment and spreading out and growing the economic opportunity for frontline communities. Don't think of the communities as recipients, but think of them as that next level player in this game. You're going to be relying upon the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian caucus. Those leaders want to look at also how their communities are going to benefit. And this is going to be a critical conversation because it's about the money, it's about the investment, but also it's about the quality of life. So from the public health to the jobs, to the community infrastructure that protects public health and jobs, the opportunities are all there. And so I'm looking forward for us to also dig into this. So I think that we're looking at the regulatory framework, but also the economic side of this and having it in a real meaningful way drill down and work its way down to these frontline communities.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate that and helping us see the larger picture here. So would like to close it out with our introductions. Would like to introduce Eric Walker. Eric is an Energy Justice Senior Policy Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Adriana. I'll try and keep my opening comments here brief, because I think there's a lot of agreement amongst the panel in terms of some of the things that we're interested in or have some ongoing concern about in terms of the preliminary development of the proposal here. I would like to, for those of you who don't know, We Act, just quickly introduce the organization and myself and name a couple of high priority areas of our. I am having a problem with my video. Sorry, folks. See if we can hold on to that. So We Act as a community-based organization that's been involved in environmental justice for the better part of 30 years. Started out working on wastewater treatment exposure issues and has broadened its focus into areas of other toxin exposures, including healthcare products, beauty products, and now climate justice as it increasingly touches upon other facets of daily life. With that said, I am most concerned with this program around three issues: the exposure to toxins, not just emissions and co-pollutants, but in addition, as Raya mentioned, the intersection of that with our gas system as it impacts across scale, from the site specific of our homes to the site specificity of peaker plants to the site specificity of generation facilities. And then to Brother Aaron's point around the economics of this, we're really concerned about mitigating the regressive impacts of the program, of a cap and invest program on disadvantaged communities, as well as other asset limited and income constrained communities that may not be fully incorporated into the definition of disadvantaged community or fully represented in the mapping that's been done given the disadvantaged community criteria. So those are just some really high level cautions there, as well as this, what I think is increasingly important is integration of disadvantaged community representation in the overall governance and monitoring and adaptation of the program over time. While we know that there's a potential role for the Climate Justice Working Group to integrate the NYSERDA program into its role in reviewing and updating the scoping plan, it is not sort of set in stone. It is not a default. It is not so prescribed as part of that role. And so thinking very clearly and holistically about what governance of this program as part of the overall framework of managing how the state achieves its goals is going to be critically important for all of the concerns around exposure and meeting the equity mandates of the Climate Act. And with that, I'll just quickly say I am grateful to be in joining y'all in dialogue, some esteemed colleagues and folks in the audience here, and would welcome more dialogue as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to all the panelists for your statements there to help kick off our discussion. You know, we created this space to hear from you, and for you to be able to advise New York State on precisely on what you're talking about, the guardrails, the metrics, the specific policy mechanisms that you think are essential to center equity in this program. And so I want to start, at that bigger picture here, sort of at the macro level. And I want to ask this of all of you, if you could weigh in, and may have touched on this a little bit already, but what does it mean specifically in your mind to have a cap and invest system that centers equity? Eddie, I heard from you the three scenarios that can lead to negative outcomes, but what does it mean to center equity? And specifically the regulatory, programmatic, procedural enforcement, what does that mean for cap and invest to center equity? And I want to, Eddie, I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. So I think a number of us have talked about what equity means. Some of it, thankfully, is legislated, right? The CLCPA, pretty clearly lays out that anything that leads to increased emissions in disadvantaged communities is not something that state law will allow. So for us, the other question is, and I think this was teased out by one of the items that the state is currently considering. I mean, obviously, our preference is no trading. We believe that trading, invites volatility, invites a less transparent system, one that allows for gamesmanship as well as banking and the rest. But from our perspective, I think what's critical about one of the items that you guys are looking at is the fact that when we're talking about emissions reduction, whether it's co-pollutants or greenhouse gases, we have to be intentional when it comes to disproportionately impacted communities. The vast, for the vast majority of at least my work in environmental justice, in the environmental justice sector, oftentimes when they talk about reducing emissions in EJ communities, they talk about it in a net zero context, right? And we're way past net zero considerations. We need to be aiming for net positive reductions, right? So if there is an overall pollution level that a disadvantaged community is laboring under, if we're not actively as a state trying to figure out how to reduce overall emissions, then we're not living up to the letter of the law that we laid out for ourselves. I think that when we look at some of the other components of what makes a cap, and again, let's call it cap trade. By the way, folks, I'm not going to call this thing Nikki. I'm not going to buy into the euphemisms, the infantilization of and by the way, Prince will be turning over in his grave if he heard Nikki was being used for this kind of program. But yeah, I went there. I keep hearing Prince whenever I hear this, and that's not a good look for us as a state. It's cap, trade, and invest. So if we're looking at issues like, in addition to no trading, no offsets, and no unlimited banking, we're looking for sector-specific and declining caps, right? Like we need to be driving emissions to zero, and that's part of the problem. Is that from our perspective, from movement's perspective, we never saw cap market-based mechanisms as the way to reduce emissions. It's why, as a movement, we fought for the actual mandate first, which was the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Without a mandate, you again have the problem that so often we face as communities, that market-based mechanisms lend themselves to market-based gamesmanship. I'll stop there because I know some of my colleagues have additional thoughts, but yeah, let me stop there.
No, I think Eddie raises a very fine point. And the case where gamesmanship can occur is when you have multiple facilities within a small area. And so if you're looking at one facility and what its particular cap is, and you're ignoring the other facilities, and here we've had a robust conversation around cumulative impacts and cumulative burden. So when you got to look at these things, not in the isolated instance or trading instance, but actually all those facilities that are within that area, within that airshed, within that public health shed of a frontline community. And so I think that, this goes to another point where there's perverse incentives to game the system. The system also must have the elasticity to actually also on the investment side, where we start to see that has to be built in at the front end, that the increased immediate investment in those targeted areas to push back against any such game or any particular, as I said, unusual peak or spike in a particular area where we see certain type of market activity resulting in a community being unnecessarily burdened.
Thanks. Eric, you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, I think it's important. I'll echo Eddie's comments around the need to really draw some, I'm sorry, I'm losing my video again here. It's a weird thing happening. But on the trading issue, I think it's super important to make sure that if there's going to be some limited version of trading allowed through the program, that we are modeling that very clearly and transparently to understand the impact of that trading at multiple scales, to Aaron's point, because we have both geographic specificity in terms of peaker plants that need to be monitored. We have an air monitoring program that can be used to support some of that specificity in terms of monitoring, evaluation, and then, you know, alerting or informing us of whether or not those tools are actually getting us to emissions reductions at varying scales. Because to just, again, to echo something that Eddie said, we talk about these societal level reductions, and we really need to be thinking about place as a way in which people are actually impacted by the work that's done within this program, and more broadly by the state's work in the Climate Act overall.
Thanks, Eric. And your video's in and out, but thankfully we can hear you just fine. And then Raya, do you want to close us out on this question on, you know, what does it mean to have a cap and invest system that centers equity specifically?
Yes, I do. And I just want to drive this point home again, is that the best way to be equitable is, in addition to, you know, Brother Eddie's discussions about the climate law and what it requires, is success of the program. And the program design must result in actually seeing the retirement of these fossil fuel plants, as Eddie mentioned, getting to zero. You can't throw money, you know, and I think we've seen that in California, you know, where we don't get emissions coming down and you want to try and throw money at the problem to fix it. That is not going to do the trick. That's true on a you know, on an intellectual level, right? Like anything less than shutting down power plants is a distraction from the goals of the CLCPA. We need to be moving away from fossil fuels, period. And it's also what the scoping plan says. We did the analysis. We've got to move off combustion. We've got to stop burning gas. And that's in the generation, and that's in our distribution sector. And so this program has to get us to zero, and it has to do it in a way that prioritizes emissions and co-pollutants in frontline communities and does not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. Period.
Thank you, Raya. I appreciate that. So, you know, one thing that I'm sort of hearing maybe across all of the responses here is one key element here is sort of a sense of like a rapid response and a really sophisticated sort of monitoring system. So we know you know, where the investments are being made, the impact of those investments, the emissions, the co-pollutants, where they're happening, and making sure that we're getting to success, as you said, Raya. So thank you for that. And it's also come up specifically several times that there are equity and justice provisions in the law. Shout out to the advocates, the lawmakers, and everyone who worked on the Climate Act to make it a reality. But the Climate Act, you know, is we have to design a cap and invest program to achieve the mandates of the Climate Act, and that includes those climate justice provisions, right? The investments for that 35% with a goal of 40% of the benefits of our energy efficiency and clean energy investments in New York State need to be realized in disadvantaged communities. That's one. Another is, you know, Section 7.3, which has been talked about a lot in this panel so far, the requirement under the law to prioritize disadvantaged communities for emissions and co-pollutant reductions, and importantly, you know, that our state decision-making, including, you know, DEC and really across the state, as John Binder mentioned in his presentation, making sure that our decision-making does not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And I think, as you said earlier, Raya, any program that leads to a disproportionate burden on disadvantaged communities under the law is not allowed to go forward, right? And so I think we should define these terms together. I know that the state team and the rulemaking team are having conversations about what these means, but I think, you know, we've heard from environmental justice leaders like all of you for years that it's important to have a seat at the table and to define these terms together. So, from your perspectives, what does it mean for this program to prioritize disadvantaged communities for emission and co-pollutant reductions? And importantly, how can the regs be designed to ensure these reductions? And we can't design the program that would, in a way that would disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. But it'd be helpful to hear from all of you, what you expect to see from the state team in terms of demonstrating a program that does not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. Like, what is that? How do you define that, model it, analyze it?
Well, one of the things I think it's a very great question, and I thank you for that question, because one of the most critical burden is community-based organizations and EJ organizations in frontline communities that are dealing in this space, is capacity, right? And businesses are always asking for incentives, market incentives, and et cetera. But the most important thing when we talk about from the investment end is making sure the communities have the capacity to be full-fledged partners in this. So we're not begging for money. This program is essential for community-based organizations to have the adequate funding. So when we talk about what are the funding things that we invest in right now, where are these EJ and community-based organizations and partnerships that are right now working in the interests of these communities? Those are major assets that we need to invest in right at the front end, full stop. Because relying upon volunteers like the group of the four of us here right now is not sustainable, has never been sustainable, and it has always been a burden. But more importantly, we look at any chamber of commerce as it advanced the interest of corporations and businesses, et cetera, because we have a few chamber of commerce entities here. The chamber of commerce, when it comes in the environmental justice space, are the community-based organizations and their partnerships and leadership that have been actually driving this conversation. I've been in this space, over 35 years. It's, when you think of the national EJ movement, two of the biggest early settlements in the EJ movement were West Harlem Environmental Action and Arbor Hill, over what the communities being poisoned, gassed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being is that, one would still think that at this stage of the game, the states and federal government would be investing in these structures in a meaningful way so that they are absolutely strong, not agitators, but strong agents, and giving the communities agency to be at the table, the same way some of the corporate partners and corporate disruptors are at the table right now or use their campaign donations to get at the table to influence the CLCPA. So my thing is right now is that investment in community-based organizations right now is one of the most important steps, I think, in moving that ball and empowering the community.
Just to piggyback on what Aaron is saying, I think I mentioned earlier the mix of policies that we think. Oh, by the way, Adriana, by calling it cap and invest, are you signaling that the state is not considering trading anymore? I'm just curious.
No, I think as John mentioned earlier, that there's some trading that is going to be part of this program, but I hear you, Eddie, on the terminology.
Yeah, let's call it cap, trade, and invest, right? So in addition to the no trading, and by the way, just an example about the trading, right? Among the options I've heard discussed is no trading in disadvantaged communities and DECs, right? On the surface, that might sound amenable to folks, but to be candid, how do you police? How do you implement a program where if you have disadvantaged communities, chances it's possible that you're going to have a community that's identified as a DAC, and literally across the street from that DAC, you'll have a polluting facility. Does that apply to that? Like, it just feels like an unworkable, although well-intentioned workaround. But yeah, again, for us, looking at where cap and trade has increased emissions, or at least slowed the increase of emissions, we keep landing on no trading, no offsets, no unlimited banking, sector specific and declining caps. And by the way, just another note about on the investment side of it, I would feel better about the state's ability to reach the 35 to 40% levels if I knew three things, right? One is, how has the state, since the law passed, been honoring the 35%, right? The law's been passed now since 2019. We've had 3 years of at least of budgets. How are we doing with the 35%? I know that on the Climate Justice Working Group, we learned that the state wasn't even tracking up until about 2018 or so where clean energy funding was going on the RGGI, for example, right? So in order for us to be able to have any ability to feel confident in the state's ability to live up to the law, how have you guys been doing for the last 3 years? And right now, how are we spending IRA and federal money, right? Like there's a ton of money coming our way. We've been told, and I've heard repeatedly, that the CLCPA criteria will be applied to federal funding as well. There's no website, as far as I could tell, that tracks how this money is being spent federally in New York State. And finally, like, okay, so this is where we were, this is what we're doing now. How do we protect in the future against budget raids? What are the safeguards against raiding, as we've seen RGGI routinely for years was raided whenever there was a government need that was deemed more important. So yeah, I think that when we talk about, and let me just give you one small example of how, again, equity, just, you know, the ability to be able to reach equitable conclusions, we keep missing obvious opportunities. A lot of us know there's something called regional economic development councils. These are the bodies set up across the state that are supposed to give the ESDC guidance as to where and how they should be spending money. As far as I know, none of these regional economic development councils have any environmental justice people on those councils. So even the council structure and infrastructure that's set up to help guide state expenditures, you know, is totally missing here. So again, I'll stop there, but I think that forget the emissions. From the investment side, there are a lot of questions that you know, we're grappling with.
Yeah, I want to thank you for those comments. And I want to get back to, you know, again, you know, that design side, like what does this design look like? And I want to keep hammering home to Eddie's point. Personally, I can see the implementation of a cap and invest. Cap and trade, I don't think will get us there. And I do think that what we're talking about here is cap and trade. And I have to say, as just like a Prince stan, like any chance to talk about Prince and bring in, you know, the purple one is always a very exciting thing. But what I want to emphasize in this context is that in order to reach our climate goals, we're going to have to see these facilities shutting down. We have to see them shutting down. It cannot be a pay to pollute scenario. The mechanism of this program has to think about retirements. What does it mean to get to zero? It has to have that in the design. And that's really, you know, that was kind of your, not kind of, that was your question. How do we prioritize emissions and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities? Now, if you actually, you know, since you asked, maybe I'll answer. I would see actually focusing first on those shutdowns, even before instituting a cap and invest program. Like, how are we going to do that? We need to shut those facilities down ASAP, because that's what's going on. That's how you prioritize co-pollutant emissions reductions. And so in the context of this plan, we've got to see this enforcement. We've got to see this moving towards actual plant closures with a just transition, leaving nobody behind. These facilities have to close.
I'll just jump in there and say, I think beyond the notion of 7.3 is simply relegated to these kind of emissions reductions and co-pollutant reductions, really the administrative question that's like a concomitant part of 7.3. I think we're all talking about it in various kinds of ways, but we're not sort of narrowing in on that as a really important fact, right? So to get to plant closures, one of the ways we get there is through the docket, right? The commission docket. And there's to your earlier question about clarity around what we're doing with the CLCPA to meet these 35%. There's a CLCPA implementation docket, right? There's a proceeding that lays out where those investments are made, from 2020 to 2022, and then there's going to be another space where they're going to be geocoding energy efficiency investments along the disadvantaged community criteria by the end of this year. So like there's an array of administrative spaces within the Public Service Commission right now that need to be held up to the same scrutiny that we're giving emissions. And just by way of example, I think this sort of echoes Aaron's earlier point around this. How do we create some single view of the state's work on this particular facet of the law in order for advocates and for the general public to understand what progress we're making? And I think that continues to ring in my mind as a disproportionate burden, because what ultimately happens in places like the commission is that we had a history of packing administrative decisions into rate making, which ultimately did continue to disproportionately burden low and moderate income folks, whether it's through the rate making process or the burden of participating in an ex parte system where it's pretty much every man for themselves, and where the well-resourced have sway in what happens in the commission, and the less resourced folks do what they can to tread water if they're even able to participate in a meaningful way at all. So I just want to really kind of highlight stepping back from this hyper focus on a disproportionate burden really simply within this narrow lane of emissions, to think about the ways in which the administrative component, right, of Section 7.3 really comes into view, and how we need to address that in order to get to things like plant closures, to affordability, to the understanding, targeted investment even. I think those are really key points that we need to consider more deeply.
Great. Thanks, Eric, and thanks all of you. That was really helpful and insightful to hear. I think some of what I was hearing is that there has to be alignment in action across agencies and programs, and there has to be accountability and transparency on the funding, on what's our baseline on our spending, and how do we have those assurances? How does the public have those assurances that investments are going to be made in disadvantaged communities? So we talked a little bit about, or we've heard from you all on this call and others about the potential for allowance trading to create or exacerbate existing hotspots in disadvantaged communities. I know, Eddie, you've touched on that quite a bit in our talk so far. And that because of that, the program should have strong protections to prevent the creation of hotspots in disadvantaged communities and ensure emissions reductions occur. And I'm hearing you loud and clear, Eddie and others, that the preference here is for no trading at all to be the most protective. And I know that my colleague, John Binder, went through a couple of mechanisms under consideration by New York State right now that were also included in the scoping plan to help address this concern. And that includes, just to go over those three mechanisms again, it's prohibiting disadvantaged community sources from purchasing allowances outside of a disadvantaged community. Eddie, you spoke on that one a second ago. The second is establishing source-specific emission caps on disadvantaged community sources, sort of declining caps. And then the third is requiring that sources in disadvantaged communities surrender allowances at some multiple of emissions, rather than one-to-one. And so, Eddie, we heard you on this point earlier, but maybe I'll open up to Eric first. I'm curious to hear from you your thoughts on these three mechanisms and whether you think one is most protective of disadvantaged communities, as well as if there are other, similar mechanism that you would suggest the state consider to protect disadvantaged communities.
Thanks, Adriana. I think certainly a prohibition on trading is a most precautionary principle that we can take. I think that goes without saying. And I think that given the history of what we've seen from, in California, written by academics and other advocates, that there's reason to consider that as something really kind of fundamental at least in terms of the scenarios that we map, to understand how we manage the brinkmanship and the sort of evasive ways in which trading can undermine the actual achievement of the goals that we're trying to move through the Climate Act and this particular program. I guess I would step back and ask, put the question back to the state right now and say, if, how are you all trying conceptualizing the value of trading, right? How are we actually imagining that trading will be a useful thing in any scenario, right? I think that's a valid question that anyone would want to have a response to. And from there, I think we can have a dialogue about where the precautionary principle of prohibition comes into relief with the value proposition that's being made by the state in order to contemplate some form of trading to begin with. I think that's, I think we can all make some assumptions about what you think the value is there, but I would love to hear a precise or contextual notion of what that means, given the modeling that you're doing and given the way that you're designing conceptual program features at this stage of the game.
Piggybacking off of what Eric was saying, that was exactly was going to be my response here, is that yes, I hear, but you started your questions like, we hear you on the no trading, we don't like it, and yeah, I agree, and we don't. But those three mechanisms that you talked about and that we also discussed at the Climate Action Council and made sure was in the Climate Action Council scoping plan, I think that what I and others want to see is that modeled. Like they intuitively sound like they could be valuable tools. And I think we want, and that's what the plan says the state should consider. We want to see that considered. And I really, again, you've heard me say it several times, I'm going to keep saying it. We want to see, how does that modeling result in the actual transition and CLCPA timeline that reflects plants actually being retired? That actually sees that somebody's going to zero. Like, these are the things that we want to see if these mechanisms can address, because we know from Reggie, we know from California, you do these programs, you get overall emissions reductions, right? With them not happening as much in certain areas. That is the definition of, that's a definition of hotspot, as is, the increase in those areas. That's a hotspot. How do we turn that on its head? We want to see you model it. Show us what it looks like.
And again, the finer point, and Raya is spot on. Closing is what the key is. But the other piece in the hotspot, when you're looking at them, again, when you're talking about disadvantaged areas, a lot of this disadvantage is defined on an economic model, not a public health model. And that's one of the biggest faults and weaknesses with the federal, climate and economic justice screening tool, is that there is not a public health, component of that model. So we're not looking at asthma reduction or asthma cases or all the climate related illnesses and diseases in that advantage. And so, we're going into modeling without not looking at all the true but real significant real-time harms, physical effects and impacts on the population where a hotspot occurs. And so you do not want to create a hotspot that results in significant asthma deaths. You can always say, a company comes back, oh, well, we were permitted and regulated to do it, allowed to do this. And so, that's not on us, we were authorized. No, the answer at the end of the day is that in the case, it must be factored in. The State Health Department must deal with all those chronic respiratory illnesses and diseases that are associated with the harms caused by fossil fuels and fossil fuel combustion. That needs to be factored into the hotspot analysis. And so when we're talking about the risk, you just cannot talk, well, which of these are the best? The question is like, which amount of death do you want or is acceptable from a hotspot, given that we have tool A, tool B, or tool C?
And just to piggyback, I couldn't agree more with both Aaron's call for modeling, including healthcare costs, containment, and Raya and Eric's point about, look, let's make sure your modeling includes no trading, right? In addition to the fact that it probably means even more resources for the program. But I just want to kind of point out how already the promises to DACs are starting to crumble before we even get to cap, trade, invest to it. A few months ago, budget passes. A lot of us are happy. Included in the budget are a lot of the components, the Build Public Renewables Act, including, mandate that NYPA, New York Power Authority, close down peaker plants by 2030. Fast forward a few months, all of a sudden, New York Independent Systems Operators up in arms, talking about potential projected supply problems, energy supply problems for the grid. And all of a sudden, the combination of potential extensions to the construction timeframe for transmission lines from upstate, offshore wind developers whistling a happy tune and giving bids that all of a sudden they want to reopen and get more money from the state. Whatever it is, all of a sudden now we're seeing NYSO basically saying, if we don't resolve the capacity problems that I don't understand why they were not foreseeable a couple of years ago, but regardless, if we don't resolve the transmission of this offshore problem, guess what? Our capacity may mean that the peaker plants will have to continue operating past whatever deadline we just legislated in the budget, right? So, forget cap, trade, and invest. Like, we've got regulatory relief opportunities right in front of the state, as well as possibilities for extending impacts, disproportionate impacts in EJ communities. I just don't understand how. And here's the other problem: and this is one of those, at some point, maybe the lawyers will argue about this, but what Section 7.3 doesn't say is it doesn't say you cannot reduce pollution more slowly in EJ communities, which is the best we can hope for with cap, trade, and invest, right? Which is that, our emissions will go down. They're just not going to go down as much as everybody else's, which is, I guess, the height of the irony is that's where most of the impacted and with the cluster of impacts live. So, yeah, I got to tell you guys, I'm based on what NYSO just announced, based on what we know, how deadlines roll when it's transmission lines and the rest, coupled with why the state is not figuring out how to work and give the utilities what they need for a robust demand reduction program, because that's really the way to kind of go through this constraint that we're looking at and not keeping polluting peaker plants going another couple of years. Yeah, I am worried.
Yep, heard that, Eddie. Thank you for that, and thank you, everyone. I'm furiously taking notes, and I'm hoping that the team is capturing all of this. I want to do a quick sort of rapid round because something that you said earlier, Eddie, really struck me, and I wanted to make sure that I captured thoughts from other panelists about the specific mechanisms under consideration by New York State. One of them being prohibiting DAC sources from purchasing allowances outside of a DAC. You expressed earlier, Eddie, that administratively and maybe from the outcomes in DACs that might not make sense, right? Because there inevitably will be a polluting facility right across the street. Just by a show of hands or a quick, yes or no, do folks agree with Eddie on that point? Is that one that you believe maybe New York State should take off the table and not consider, or do you share those concerns about that option?
Well, what it's trying to do, it's like a mechanism that's trying to say, hey, if you're located in a community and you're harming that community, you should not figure out ways to continue that harm under this program. That's part of why I would love to see the modeling, because the intent of what it's trying to do, I get where it's coming from, but I can, like Brother Eddie, see a whole myriad of ways where that could be evaded.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's really about intention versus what the scenarios tell us, right? And so if we don't have, I think there's a spectrum, right? And to me, 1, 2, and 3 represent a spectrum of flexibility, right? And that spectrum needs to be very transparently and to the level of detail possible laid out for us to understand how the intention may or may not be met by what's allowed under under any of the scenarios. And so I think I personally remain committed to the precautionary principle of we need to do more good than the disproportionate burden that has been experienced by people. And I think others would agree with that. And that needs to be built in to the modeling that is done, at least in any number of the scenarios here, as a sort of test for the value proposition of the current conceptual framework for the program. If that makes sense.
I'll cut to the right of Eddie and just say, no, I think that if the goal is to to shut these things down, the answer is we should be moving affirmatively in that direction. Full stop. You know, these little dances and trying to model it out, but still giving them another year, another 2 years, another 3 years or longer of existence while the harms are persistent upon the communities. You know, we're at a stage right now, given the current level of climate disruption and the fossil fuel driven impacts, that, you know, we must say no. Full stop. You know, at least my perspective.
We got rules, right? Until we have the program rules are supposed to come out in the beginning of the year, right? So like, why not, right? Let's use that idea of shut it down, like Raya said, shut it down. This is where we're trying to go. How do we have, you know, clarity around what is being formulated in order to know what programmatic design features are actually going to get us to those goals? Getting long-term permanent closure of peakers and fossil fuel generation in the states, enough revenue in pocket to make targeted investments to do more good than the disproportionate burden people have experienced, and the like. To me, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think the proof is in the pudding. And right now, you know, but there's not enough ingredients in the sauce to come up with the pudding, right? So I need to see data modeled, and then I also need to have additional backstops that support the interagency integration of all the administrative work that's necessary in order to do that, because we cannot be modeling scenarios in lieu of the way that the reliability study is being used as a sort of buffer for the hard challenges and hard decisions that need to be made in any number of dockets in the Public Service Commission, or in the Department of Public Service, or being used as a justification by the fossil fuel industry to prop up investments in the fossil fuel infrastructure, right? We got $150 billion being laid out for leak-prone pipe prevention that is really a signal, an implicit signal that we're going to be continuing to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure in a cut your nose off to spite your face kind of scenario, where we need to be fully transitioning to a different system of distributing energy in the state. So like, to me, I think we need to see more data. I think we need to hold our precautionary principles. We need to use them as a way to test given the evidence, and then hold firm on that timeline towards the end of the year when rules are supposed to be made. And then we can make the hard calls around, no, that doesn't work, shut that stuff down, or, you know, this is the value proposition the state's making around a limited number of trading allowances. And we can see how that gets us to both investment, to level of investment necessary to put into communities, and an enforceable, transparent declining cap in the system.
Hey, Adriana, quick question. Are you guys in a position to be able to share any of your modeling inclinations with Cap Trade and Invest? You've heard several recommendations from us, I guess primarily like making sure that no trading is among the modeling options, but what can you guys share about what you guys are doing regarding modeling?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eddie. And I know that John mentioned earlier that we had a roundtable on modeling back in June. And so we'll definitely tee up a response to that one in the Q&A. But I'm hearing a lot of, I think, really solid input from this conversation about like what that modeling needs to include. And I want to make sure we'll take that back. And if those things aren't being considered, you know, have those conversations across like with the regulatory team. And I think what I was hearing, you know, from all of you in response to this last question is like, and which makes complete sense from my perspective, is like, don't ask us to comment on a policy scenario in a vacuum. Let's comment on a policy scenario with the data in front of us and use that to drive, you know, the decisions and the concerns that we have. So heard that loud and
You know,
clear.
one thing, and I'm sure this is something you probably thought of, but I was in some great docket in California eons ago. But one of the things they did is they actually released some versions of a model that empowered stakeholders to actually manipulate it. You know, it's, you know, lots of folks are going to be doing different type of analyses, but that I just mentioned that because that was helpful, because there were flaws to the model that they had and there were things to say about that, but folks were actually able to use the model to evaluate it.
Got it.
The
So,
state's model.
Okay. So kind of sticking a little bit along those lines, one thing that you know, John Binder mentioned at the close of his presentation was that NYSERDA and DEC is going to develop analysis on air quality and health impacts and workforce implications from this program, and that will be released and accompany the draft rule publication. And I know that, Aaron, you've talked a lot about public health during this conversation, so I'll tee it up for you first, but you know, are there specific inputs and assumptions that you think are key for New York State to consider as we develop this analysis? And what are the specific criteria that you think New York State should use to evaluate the health and workforce implications on disadvantaged communities?
Well, right now, I don't even see it even at the table or being considered, but it should be. And I think that, you know, number one, you know, most concerns when we talk about frontline communities, when people talk about, they don't talk about in terms of DEC regulation or NYSERDA grants. They talk about, I can't breathe. They're talking about health consequences and health outcomes. Every time a community has an impact, it's manifests itself in a public health crisis. And the fact that that is the case, and we're just coming off of COVID as well, you know, so now with long COVID, long-term other chronic diseases that are complicating the impacts of upper respiratory illnesses and infections, you know, having this process proceed without that being a critical factor. Again, lessons learned at the table is key. A big gap here, I think, you know, and I think one of the things that is raising a bright line in my mind is that interagency professional coordinator. And I just think that role needs, and it's a bigger conversation that not to be put off down the road, but right now, you know, as I say, a regrouping by the governor in the state saying, listen, we are missing key leaders, you know, at the table. You know, and, you know, but there's also critical conversations and decision-making that's going on right now. You know, the New York Power Authority leadership was just recently appointed by the governor with no Senate oversight or input or comment, which is problematic. You know, we talk about transparency and inclusion and making sure we got the right voices that are going to absolutely, we want to have the confidence and comfort that we have certainty and trust in the leadership that's going to be at the table, advocating for all of us in this particular space, not biased toward any one sector or the other. And this is one of the critical things. These appointments matter. Who's at the table at the state level matters. The fact that the public health portion is not there, the state economic development portion is not there. You know, these are critical pieces of the pie that are essential to frontline communities and are very determinative, and as I say, relative to the success, you know, of overall.
Right. Anybody else want to chime in on that, on public health or workforce considerations?
I'll just add, and I know that as Eddie knows very, very well, you know, we spent almost 4 years going through that Climate Action Council and Climate Justice Working Group process and unearthed a tremendous amount of data by zip code on many different indices, you know, about public health, just the beginning. But we've got a lot of that to leverage. We should continue leveraging it. We also had a tremendous amount of work happen through the Just Transition Working Group. identifying, they did a lot of work to look at which facilities are, gas generation or before 1958 and really should be looking at retiring. And what does it look like to look at an entire community, not just the, in terms of the tax base, what's going to happen with the schools, in terms of when those things shut down. And of course, the job study that was incredibly detailed and talked about the fantastic, huge number of jobs that will be created versus decline. So just wanted to say that I think we should leverage that, and we should continue and invest in that type of science and social science, but we should substantively leverage that, of course, with an increasing equity lens on MWBEs, disadvantaged communities, disabled folks, women, LGBTQ, undocumented folks, continue to bring that lens and invest in that.
Yeah, just to piggyback on some of these items from a health perspective, I mean, yeah, Raya is right. We spent literally years trying to develop all the different components of what became the state climate plan, including the disadvantaged community criteria. And Adriana, you can attest, like there was a moment where the working group came up with over 120 different indices that we thought, okay, if you want to really capture what a disadvantaged community is, you got to try to get all 120 of these. And one of the things that was surprising to us was there is some health data that is just not collected. It's not collected because it's just not something that the state thought of, or was something that was even something that's coordinated between municipalities and state government. I'm trying to remember which one. I think it was how many people die of extreme heat by county or something in the state. I'm not sure. That seems to be one of the health indicia, but I guess the point is that there's a lot of health indicators that we came up with in the Climate Justice Working Group. And also remember, there were a lot of others that the data just wasn't being collected as such by the state, and the state is beginning to do that. For example, on the heat side of things, I think now the state is actually embarking on a plan to try to collect all this data. So yeah, Aaron's point, Raya's point in terms of health stuff, we've done a great job, I think, picking up a lot of stuff, and there's still yet more health indicia that you can't apply it to a criteria if the state is not collecting it. And it's not always the state's fault that there isn't the kind of data collection. And then there's HIPAA. There are all kinds of things we need to be mindful of when we talk about health impacts. But even putting HIPAA aside, there's still more that can be done in terms of data collection. From a workforce development, all I can tell you guys is, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, along with a number of our other partners on this call, are all part of something called New York Renew, statewide coalition. And we have included organized labor in the coalition. I've had and continue to have dialogue with them. But for the record, what we've been saying all along from a workforce development perspective is that jobs created by this program should meet obviously high labor standards, including prevailing wages and non-interference by management with union organizing, target job creation to low-income disadvantaged communities and workers displaced from fossil fuel energy dependent industries. Those workers should be hired immediately and trained on the job. But just to give you guys an example, one of our members, Uprose in Sunset Park, had fought literally for decades to bring offshore wind to their waterfront, even beating off an enormous rezoning application that meant to commercialize their working waterfront. They were not only able to beat that zoning application aside, but that opened the door for offshore wind to land. And the first offshore wind assembly in the United States, as far as I could tell, is being planned for the Sunset Park waterfront. What is the job creation and the job recruitment looking like in Sunset Park? To hear my members say it, it's all the usual job development groups that are being reached out to, not the EJ groups. So, again, we're already seeing a nascent industry starting to blow up. And what is the state doing to make sure that company is doing the right thing and looking to the community, that's the host community, to hire and train people for those jobs or something?
I'll say two things really quickly. One is that the state has an existing health and all policies framework that needs to be brought into the current era and made to include everything from the executive order that the governor signed calling racism a public health crisis to some of the health and well-being issues that are left out of the economic considerations in the disadvantaged community criteria and in the economic modeling of this cap and invest system, cap and trade and invest system. Whoever wants to, I'll let y'all wrestle over that name. So, and that includes the psychological impacts of economic precarity that is persistently faced by, again, low and moderate income and asset limited and constrained households across the state, regardless of whether or not you're in a disadvantaged community. So what we're trying to do in terms of economic development is to create and alleviate those kinds of burdens, right? We could go on and on about that, but suffice it to say that when I was on the local government and land use sub-working group for to support the Climate Action Council, that came up quite often in terms of thinking about how local governments can play a more substantive role in supporting the transition, is to think about its relationship to a health and human services infrastructure that is deployed by the state that local governments are mostly dependent upon to support the needs of low and moderate income households across the state. So like we need to think about how our health and human services are interfacing with our ability to model the goals or can be modeling inputs into the goals of a cap and invest system. And so there's just tons and tons of money that are being leveraged to support alleviating some of those burdens in communities that show up as home energy assistance, that show up as in some cases in county governments, housing supports for environmental health remediation, et cetera, that need to be brought into some relief here that I think could be really useful.
Got it. Thank you, Eric. That was really helpful. So I'm going to move us along a bit because we're a little short on time, and I want to save some time for questions from the panelists that have been trickling in throughout the event. So this is the last question that I'm going to ask to the full panelists here. Skipping ahead to sort of communications and engagement. You know, we heard from stakeholders that disadvantaged communities representation should remain part of the program from now through implementation. And I want to hear, you know, what are your recommendations to keep a balance of involvement and consideration of time constraints on community members and EJ leaders like yourselves? And, you know, what does successful and robust communication look like as we continue to develop this program?
Ooh, I kind of want to answer. It's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Go ahead,
So yes, I hear you about the balance of time. It's a lot. On the very top end, and I've said this many times, and I know folks get it, we need the state to do more pop ed, public ed on this period generally. The Climate Act, the Scoping Plan, and this program, though, in particular, folks just don't know. I think that means putting budget, you know, you have to put budget behind it. And as I think the state did with the CAC process and the Climate Justice Working Group process, what's really helpful is when you put budget and resources behind these stakeholder processes. I think that's really, really important because when it can be iterative, but the state can offtake some of that, the burden of analysis. I think that happened through at least some of the Climate Action Council processes pretty effectively in terms of like providing support and analysis and iteration there. But the overarching thing, in addition to really just needing to do more comms period, making sure that any process is as well resourced as possible. But I think the most important thing is that consultation is not the administration of justice. You know, like you need to be including people at the table. Folks want to see that those suggestions are actually being incorporated, and that at any regard, working with stakeholders and having a seat at the table, which is very, very important, does not resolve the state of its responsibility to administer equal protection of, from environmental burden, equal enforcement of environmental laws, and equitable distribution of the benefits and harms of, environmental amenities. So so that you need to be talking with folks, you need to be listening with folks, you need to be resourcing those conversations. And that does not equal actual justice. That does not equal environmental justice or alleviate environmental racism. You have to be focused on the enforcement too.
Thanks, Raya. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I'd say that the state has historically really not done a very good job of this work of public engagement, of public education, of like these kinds of conversations beyond when something is like needed, right? Like we're in the process of developing a program rules. And so we have these kinds of conversations when there's a trigger. They're just slightly echoing Raya, but maybe even thinking a bit more broadly, is that we just don't have an understanding within the sort of totality of the state bureaucracy about what relationship in community means and how to sort of create tiers of communication to normal people. There are 142 people on this call. Many of them, I imagine, are, have been in this wheelhouse before, right? How do we leverage the capacity of either local governments or CBOs or, other, health and human service related organizations to actually define and develop, what the engagement should and could look like, right? That's not just, hi, you're at Home Depot today, get an induction stove, or hey, have you heard of this thing called Nikki? Who? What? That Prince song?
Wait a minute. Wait, I thought we did that.
So I just think that there's an intention to move beyond engagement when it is triggered to engagement as a function of government, right? That is not what we see coming out of most of the administrative bureaucracies, even when they operate on the assumption that anybody could go in whenever they want, again, to the ex parte system of the Public Service Commission. Literally, the default assumption is that anybody can and anybody could if they wanted to, when they want to, because it's all there. But all there doesn't mean really anything, right? Ex parte doesn't really mean anything. And outside of, if you know, you will. And when you have resources and it's opportune, you will. And we just need to flip all of those assumptions around. Like, if they know they will come and when they know they will come won't work either, right? So like, what does a proactive notion of communication look like beyond the usual suspects and a more robust infrastructure that it goes beyond triggered events that require the mobilization of time and talent and treasure in order to satisfy a regulatory requirement so nobody gets sued?
And that's a very important point in this. And as I say, always what's daylighted in the EJ community and the EJ conversation is also true for the whole state. I just think that the community engagement beyond EJ communities, community engagement in general, on this whole process has always been lacking, and the investment and the lack of investment, I just think, is key. And yes, we cannot just rely upon the networks of the usual suspects, but that also must be matched with the investment in community-based organizations to really push this out to the grassroots and to the communities around New York State. I mean, this is not only empowering for EJ frontline communities, but highlighting this real, as I say, when the broad-based communities or mainstream communities, they catch a cold, we get pneumonia. So right now, we have serious pneumonia when it comes to communication and outreach and investment and the infrastructure that's needed to really help push this out, but also to engage. That is also true, in majority of other communities as well. And I just think that it only helps the state, I think, in pushing this out, but also building ownership, in every county, in every city, in every community around the state. Sure, there are going to be those, who, like I said, they'll always be left field. But right now, the direction that we're on, I just think that the investment that needs to be put in the front end is critical and key. And I think Eric is spot on, but I would even just push it a little bit further that right now we need to be talking about dollars right now, rolling out this message and rolling out support for community engagement around these issues, and even daylighting issues that we haven't even highlighted here.
Thank you.
And just to piggyback, and leave it to Raya to come up with the quote that I'm going to make into a T-shirt if I can make the letters fit. Consultation is not the administration of justice. I'm going to use that somehow, right? Look, yes, it's early and often. Like I just worry that again the scale and scope of the problem is not being communicated effectively, or I think urgently enough to New Yorkers. And it's not just a New York State problem, it's a federal problem, it's a New York City problem. Look, just a few weeks ago, we had the skies turn orange, right? And there was no statement from the mayor until late in the day. And he expressed frustration later when he said, we did all that we were supposed to do. What else are we supposed to do? Put out the fires? No, Mayor, you're supposed to help protect the most vulnerable. The next day, or 2 weeks later at a council hearing, the emergency management commissioner says, we can't protect everyone. Do you realize how those words land for environmental justice communities? We are always the first ones forgotten. So when we're hearing the leaders of our city say, what do you want me to do? Put out the fires and we can't protect everyone? That's a signal that we are on our own, people. And we've known this as EJ communities for a long time. But I think that the main problem is that people are not hearing this. We know the state has said that we need about $10 to $15 billion a year, private and public money, to help really do the just transition that we need in New York State. And by the way, that's a transition. We know transitions are inevitable, justice is not. And so from our perspective, even the cap trade and invest proposal, that's not going to come up with the $10 to $15 billion. There's money right now that the state needs to additionally identify so that when people are saying, hey, wait a minute, why are my costs going up? They need to understand your costs are going to go up anyway. But do you want your costs to go up to secure your energy future? Or do you want your costs to go up and continue subsidizing the fossil fuel industry? There's basic education that I'm really fearful people are not getting the gist of.
Thank you, Eddie. I appreciate that, and I'll let that be the last word for the panel. Tried as I might, we are very short on time, so I'm going to try to get through as many questions as possible. I want to say thank you to our panelists so much for being here, for participating. I looked up at one point, and I was like all forehead because I'm leaning in during the conversation, close to the camera. I'm listening. I feel called in by all of you, little chicharrado as well, but that's okay. So let's just kick it off to a couple of questions. We were talking about engagement, so let's just continue on that. Someone asked a question: how will stakeholder groups be identified and engaged with? So something NYSERDA is doing is they're working in partnership with 13 community serving organizations with missions focused on climate, economic, and environmental justice to launch the Energy Equity Collaborative. To build a larger public network of organizations beyond the usual suspects, to your points, to engage on policies and programs. The groups will be identified based on their advocacy, their mission, and their community service orientation as it relates to reducing burdens, also their geographic location, and their connection and experience with the culture and working with their communities hand in hand. So they'll be engaged through outreach, offering information on program access, seeking input on program development, and be invited to participate in the collaborative to improve the way the state engages, which I'm hearing from you all, that you want us to work on that. And we're also making ourselves available to community members and organizations, and DEC will continue to engage as well with community representatives like you all and many others with direct outreach sessions and community events. I also see another question here. How do we have clarity about, what's being formulated within the cap and invest regulatory design in order to make programmatic and regulatory suggestions that will get us to our collective goals? That's something we wrote down from Eric that he said earlier, and I'm going to turn it over to John to give us an answer.
Yeah, thanks, Adriana, and really thanks for this, great panel discussion. It's been really enlightening for us. I appreciate it. I think here that maybe it's helpful to just go back to the timeline slide and the process slide, which I think was maybe slide 4 or 5. I don't know if Cadmus is able to pull that back up. But really, just the point is, we're still at an early phase where we're going to be coming out with program leanings later in this year, and that I think will be able to give folks an indication of really where we're headed. We recognize that as we're sitting here today, you don't have decisions to react to or even leanings to react to, and that's part of the struggle. I recognize that, but later on in the second phase, as we've kind of digested this input and provided again the program leanings of where we think we're headed, I think that's where we'll be able to get a sense of to what extent we have properly absorbed this input and included it in our program design. You'll have an opportunity to react to that as well before we actually go out with a formal regulatory proposal, which again, we'll have another opportunity to give us input on.
Great. Thank you, John. And stick around because the next one I'm also going to tee up for you as well.
Yeah,
I think this
sure.
also came, through the chat. But how will Cap and Invest prioritize disadvantaged communities and EJ areas to deliver meaningful improvements to air quality and public health?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the key questions. This is what we've been discussing here, and that's what we want to hear from folks about in terms of what's the best way to do that. We know that the program overall is going to achieve emission reductions on a state level. We want to make sure it also does that in the local communities. We talked about a few options that we think could help to ensure that outcome. We heard some discussion about how those might not in and of themselves be enough, and so we want to make sure we can do that. And so I know there's going to be more ideas about ways to do that going forward.
Great. Next question, are you aware that emissions have been going up in New York counties with the most CAFOs, so confined animal feeding operations, as New York State continues to invest in caps for manure pits and anaerobic digesters? The CAFOs are getting larger, digesters leak methane while smaller dairies go out of business, abandoning manure pits that continue to leak methane. So the question is, what provisions is under consideration for farm workers and low-income communities near these CAFOs?
Yeah, there's a lot in this question. We're certainly aware that agriculture in general is a source of greenhouse gas emissions, and one of the things that we have to determine is the point of compliance. And this goes back to the distinction that we talked about a lot in the June webinars, and we had a series of infographics to describe the question about obligated versus non-obligated sources. And so when it comes to things like agricultural sources, or really, I think there's been some other questions about other types of sources too, distribution, fuel distributors, for example, and who's going to be having the compliance obligation. This kind of list of obligated sectors with the program is something that we're interested in hearing feedback on from everybody, but ultimately it's going to be defined as part of the program. In terms of the investment piece, I think that goes to, again, some of the planning that has to be done and how we're going to be providing for investments to address various sectors and reduce emissions in the agricultural sector and other sectors as well.
Thanks, John. And then last question, because I see we're right at 3 o'clock here, for John and Vlad from NYSERDA, if you want to jump in as well. It's a question that Eric asked during the panel, about like how are we conceptualizing the value of trading and why is it perceived as useful in our scenarios and in our planning. And I recognize we may want to take that back and provide a really thoughtful response to it. But just off the top of your head here, do you have a response to that question for the panelists and the public to hear?
I think it's a really important question and a good one, and one that we definitely can't do justice to in just another minute here. But I think at a high level, what I would want to emphasize is that it's really about cost effectiveness overall. Obviously, cost effectiveness and minimizing costs for the program is one of the requirements of the Climate Act, and so we believe, and we think there's a lot to support this, that a Cap and Invest program is the most cost-effective way of achieving the overall statewide emission limit that's set forth in the Climate Act. But yeah, I'll turn it to Vlad if he wants to add any other color to that at this point.
Yeah, pardon me. Yeah, John, I think that's right. I think maybe there's a few other items to identify. Trading provides for price stability within a system like this, because it ensures that facilities always have the ability to access sufficient allowances to comply as circumstances shift over time. And it also helps support decarbonization at individual facilities. If they own allowances, they have the ability to sell excess allowances that become excess as a result of an emission reduction investment at that facility. And that can help those facilities afford an investment, a capital investment, a decarbonization investment at the facility that might otherwise not be affordable to them. I guess maybe the one thing I'd also kind of say is that, broadly speaking, DEC and NYSERDA are focused on evaluating this program holistically across both the cap side of the program and the invest side. And so it's going to be important to think about how those things interact. So we want to be really attentive to understanding how we can design the cap to drive statewide emission reductions and cost effectiveness, and really discrete, tangible benefits in disadvantaged communities, and how the decarbonization investments enabled by the Cap and Invest program can make us enable the state to reach decarbonization investments that are not the cheapest ones, but the ones that maybe create the highest value. And a lot of those are, of course, those that address air pollution burdens in disadvantaged communities and that harm New Yorkers today and in the future.
All right, that's it. We're over time. Wish we had more time to get through questions, but I want to say sincere thank you, Eddie, Aaron, Raya, Eric, John, and Vlad as well. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your candor and your input. Lots to think about here and a lot more discussions in the future ahead of us. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
We appreciate it.